Crest, which we're going to go to right now. This is the heavy duty one I was telling you about. Please don't get distracted. Stop what you're doing and just listen to what he has to say, because he's giving you phenomenal insights into all the problems we're suffering from today.
It's good to be back.
Maybe people watching will be familiar with your work. You've been on Rebel Wisdom a few times. Your work ties together neuroscience, psychology, philosophy and culture in a really interesting way. We've talked about your work being really, really important as a kind of synthesis vision. And this conversation now we're having for a slightly different reason. Do you want to explain sort of why we're having this conversation now?
Well, I think partly because I share a very general fear of the way in which our society is moving towards highly undesirable ends. And I feel I must say something about it because it also meshes very much with my hemisphere hypothesis. In fact, what I see is the domination of a way of thinking of the left hemisphere, which is relatively simple and simply aims to help us grab things and get them, but not to understand them. And I'm worried that that is the direction in which we're going. In The Master and His Emissary, I said, we look like sleepwalkers who are shuffling our way towards the abyss. And in the, whatever it is, 13 years since I wrote that, I just feel that we are much, much closer to that abyss, and unless we wake up, we will fall to destruction.
So in a way, you're wanting to sound the alarm in a more urgent way than you have before?
Yes, not in an alarmist way, I hope, but really just to say what I see and why I think it's very important.
Could you outline why you think things are getting so serious?
There's a few of them, and they're interrelated. One which should definitely not be underrated is the proposed limitations on free speech. Free speech is an extraordinarily important and rather rare thing for a culture to be able to embrace. And it was bought by our previous generations, our forebears, at the price of often life and limb and suffering. And we're now handing it away, it seems to me, or prepared to, according to some people. This is not a good thing. However, you disapprove of certain things being said. Free speech means nothing unless it means that people are free to say things you don't like. Otherwise, it's not free speech. So that's inevitably going to be the case. But what I think history shows us is not only that a society stagnates, becomes something like the old Soviet Union, where people were afraid to speak out against policies, against the doctrines, and so forth. And so it becomes less creative, it becomes hellish to live in, but also that it's a start on something that is a path that is very worrying. Hannah Arendt said that when you say that a point of view is not worth questioning, or rather not worth questioning, but not to be questioned, you have a tyranny. And I hear people now saying that certain things cannot be questioned. That means we are in a tyranny already. Our civilization has fought for this not to happen, and we mustn't allow it to happen by default.
And how do you link this to your philosophy around the different brain hemispheres?
One is that the left hemisphere sees usually only one simple view of something, and it believes it is always right. I mean, that may sound rather like a general remark, but I've often described patients with right hemisphere strokes who simply cannot be moved away from a belief that is obviously false. And in the new book that came out less than a year ago, The Matter with Things, the first part of the book, I look at how close to the truth the left and right hemisphere are. And mistaken beliefs, delusions, hallucinations, the serious ones, the persistent ones, are much commoner when the right hemisphere is damaged and the left hemisphere is trying to construct a reality. It also tends to get very angry and very self-righteous about what it believes. It doesn't see more than one side of a question. It has no sense of nuance, of there being, well, something in this is good, but there's something in this that isn't. And that also will go for almost any point of view you care to take. So we need to have a grown-up conversation, not just scream and shout at one another and be rude. Effectively, in this world picture, nothing has meaning. It is the random collision of elements of matter. And the world is made up of these fragments of matter that are isolated from one another, that are essentially static until given a push by us, that are decontextualized, abstract, disembodied. Whatever it is that we're thinking about is taken out of context and loses any of its subtlety, complexity, or nuance. The right hemisphere, however, sees that everything is ultimately connected, that things are never static and fixed, but are evolving and changing, that they move and create complexity, beauty, and order out of their being, and that this is something that can never be disembodied and turned into a process that a machine could do. So effectively, a lot of our thinking has gone towards the idea that we are kind of faulty machines, not that the machines are very faulty versions of a human being that can do certain things more quickly, but has none of the complexity, the depth, or the meaning that is the important part of a human life.
And you mentioned freedom of speech. What are the other issues that you think are really leading us towards?
Well, the war on anything that might curiously restrict our freedom. This comes from people who are themselves extremely keen on limiting other people's freedom. As I've mentioned that already. But curiously, there is a war on things that are, in a way, could be seen from the left hemisphere's point of view, because the left hemisphere is the one that seeks power, that manipulates. It's the one that enables us to grab and get, controls the right hand. From its point of view, anything that stands in the way of its will is some kind of unwelcome constraint that it would be better if we didn't have. What are these things? They are things as simple as, and as powerful and important as nature, as the body, as intuition, imagination, spiritual meaning. All these things threaten to limit the goal setting and goal getting, if you like, left hemisphere. Whereas viewed from another point of view, these are the very things that enable us to be fulfilled. We're fulfilled not by denying nature, but by embracing our part in it, not by denying the body, but welcoming and accepting the fact that we are, with all its richness, embodied beings, that death is not some kind of terrible destruction of the meaning of life, but is an important part of what we mean by life throughout its length. That, intuitions, that imagination, that art, and the things that give us these deep insights into the great symbols and myths that our civilization has produced and other civilizations have produced, that these are not there to limit us, but to help us find our way and to fulfill ourselves.
And this is sort of reminiscent of a really fascinating conversation that we hosted a little while ago with Paul Kingsnorth and Mary Harrington, talking about, and they really summarized it as the war on limitation, which we put out as the war on reality.
And it goes further. I mean, I would very much subscribe to that view, by the way, that it is a war on reality. And what makes that clearer is that two important ways, not the only ways, but two important ways in which we come to have a sense of what is more true than at least its opposite, are science and reason. And though in my writing I always try to show that there are proper limits to what science can answer, there are proper limits to what reason can achieve, that they are nonetheless of inestimable value, and anyone who attacks them is a fool and an enemy of civilization. These two paths of science and reason are two very important ways by which we can gauge that our thinking, our direction of movement is in accord with some kind of a truth. And once you throw them out, everything is up for grabs. And then the people who shout loudest and are most insistent that other people must not offer their opinions will find themselves disenfranchised. We really will be, and I think fairly soon, in a tyranny, at least of thought, taking over the academic world and taking over the public world in which people speak about the important issues. We'll all be reduced to mouthing platitudes.
Do you feel that things are getting worse?
I'm afraid I do, yes. And, you know, you get people now saying that science is in some way a tyranny, that reason is a tyranny, that they're a plot, that they are somehow to be suspected. The only bit I agree with is, as I say, that neither of them can claim to be able to answer all our questions. And we need to take into account also intuition and imagination. The interesting thing is that when you look at great scientists, often their discoveries were made very often using intuition. The best work of mathematicians and scientists is often very clearly, from their descriptions of it, a matter of intuition, based on some early hard work, but nonetheless, the fruition is creative and comes from the imagination, and is often accompanied by a sense of beauty, interestingly. So there is no great divide between science and reason on the one hand and intuition and imagination on the other. Absolutely not. They work together, and the divide is between those who mechanize science and reason and mechanize our imagination and forbid our intuitions on the one hand, and those who celebrate the intuitive power, the creative power, the imaginative power of all of those powers.
Is it the problem that they're not even able to perceive what's going on because of the split in our perception?
I think a lot of people are very able to perceive it, which is why when I write, people respond and say, oh, wow, that's an aha moment. I realize what is happening all around me. I hadn't words to express it. But really, it's something that happens in many different ways. It's exhibited in many different ways. For example, in business, things are more micro-controlled and micromanaged than they used to be. It's less easy to allow people the degree of freedom that they can do what they want. If you don't allow people that freedom, there will be less and less creative thought coming out. And science has become less creative. It's taken steps down previously well-known paths, but it's not just my point, but it's been made by a number of people, that there was an enormously creative period in the first half of the 20th century and on just into the 60s and 70s, but that recently the great insights, the great things that move things forward have not been possible. And partly, once again, it's to do with the way in which we work. So if you allow somebody to be able to be free to think whatever they think, not police it, not say, what's the point in that, but allow it to develop, some of the times your trust will be misplaced, of course. But if you don't take that risk, you will always achieve only mediocrity, because micromanaging and micro-controlling, which is where we are now, will only produce sameness, mediocrity, and stereotyped behaviors. And it's interesting that now even the so-called, I think illiberal, but nonetheless call themselves liberal fringe, who think of themselves as opposed to stereotypes and very much in favor of diversity, are producing a mental world in which we are more and more beholden to stereotypes and in which diversity is being diminished. I mean, for example, in the past, it was well established and well known to most people that there's a very wide range of characters of men and women. And it didn't mean that because you were not a typical man or a typical woman, you were the wrong sex. That's to say that there is only one kind of entirely stereotyped male and female. Anyone else needs to swap boxes. I mean, there are, and I have looked after, occasional individuals, and they are not common, who have a very, very strong feeling that they need to have a sex change. But what's happened recently is this idea has run wild, with damaging consequences, I think, especially to children, but in general, to also our way of thinking about one of the most important and life-enhancing things about life, which is the differences that there are between the sexes, whether you are heterosexual or not.
And what do you think we can actually do about this?
I have said this so many times before that I have to just repeat myself. There aren't a set of simple things we can do. What we need to be is aware of where we're going. And I don't think we've explored fully the awfulness of where we're going. And I'd like to do that, actually, with you. But as to what we do about it, no steps taken with the same mindset we have now will work. In other words, they won't help us change our mindset. They will simply, superficially, change some things we do, will emphasize some things and not others. And I'm not saying that wouldn't have an effect. It's just that what I'm talking about here is a whole different way of looking at the world. And I really do think that we need to make that change. And one of the ways I believe this can happen is by seeing what it is we are doing, by opening people's eyes. As I say, I think people have a deep sense of disquiet about the way the world is going. They see the intrusion and obtrusion of mechanism, the banishment of humor, of life, and the banishment of joie de vivre. I mean, I worry about young people. Can they really have that carefree sense that young people always used to be able to access? Are their lives now so fettered and rule-bound and hobbled by policies and principles that they can't just be themselves? I fear so, because the research shows that young people have massively increased levels of anxiety, gloom, depression, suicidal thinking, feelings of loneliness, because of the way we now think. It's not because of one thing that happened. It wasn't that business when we put people in tower blocks or whatever. I mean, that was just part of the fragmentation of society, which we pursue at the moment in all kinds of ways. Some of these things can be reversed, and improving the way in which we conceive a community and we house a community is laudable. Stopping poisoning the seas, stopping deforesting the world, stopping persecuting indigenous people and destroying their way of life. All these things are very important goals, don't get me wrong. But in a way, they could be seen as a set of bullet points that if only we achieve those, we can carry on being the hubristic, greedy people that we are, which is ultimately the cause of our unhappiness. That happiness actually comes from a sense of partly humility about what a human being can know and be, not the sense that we know it all now, and as long as we have enough power to change things, we will change them for better. We don't know that. I mean, of course, we can't reverse the tide of technology, but we need to be incredibly careful about how we use technology, and even whether we use certain kinds of technology at all.
Yeah, you talked about younger people losing their sense of joie de vivre, their sense of freedom, and that, for me, seems intimately linked to social media. This sense that we're all on show, we're kind of, in some ways, observing each other, constantly moderating our behavior by what everyone else is doing. So in this sort of hall of mirrors that we've created, do you think that's a big part of it?
I do think it's an enormous part of it. The loss of spontaneity, the ability just to not examine everything one is saying and thinking. And this, again, links very much with the difference between the hemispheres. This, I actually call the left hemisphere's generated world a hall of mirrors, because it doesn't see anything outside of what it itself has created. It's this tiny area of our mental life, which is the bit of which we are now conscious, which has been estimated to be less than 0.5% of all that we know and experience. That awareness doesn't know about anything outside of what it is it's aware of. And that, the sense that there are other things outside used to come to us from closeness to the natural world, until...
You're listening to Professor Ian McGilchrist. We have to say goodbye to our WBA audience. We're going to their break. And just remember, support WBAI, become a buddy. Call 212-209-2950, 212-209-2950, and say you want to become a BAI buddy. It does make a difference. If you want to continue listening to the rest of this hour with Professor Ian McGilchrist talking about today's current issues, go to purn.live. Now back to the discussion.
Is not the case. It comes from a sense of cultural history with stories and myths that are passed down, which are repositories of wisdom. It comes because we are no longer in touch with the body, which tells us about things that are not under the control of our very self-conscious mind. And it leads in the end into schizophrenia. What schizophrenics describe is a paralysis in which they have to think out the simplest things like standing up or sitting down. And their thoughts are constantly imaging their thoughts. So they can't break out of this loop of virtuality. Now that seems to me, that is what, because I argue at great length in both in the Master and his emissary, but more in the Matter of Things, that schizophrenia represents, to some degree, an exaggeration of the left hemisphere's world and a diminution of the contribution made by the right hemisphere. And it leads to this highly self-conscious, abstracted, decontextualized, disembodied picture of the world, which schizophrenic subjects describe time and again. And they say also, very poignantly, they say, I seem to lack something that everyone else has, which is the ability to see things spontaneously. And actually what it boils down to is having common sense and having a bit of a sense of humor. Sense of humor comes from a sense of proportion. And if you can't exercise sense of humor, and if you don't exercise sense of humor, then things will become disproportionate. So it's something very profound that we're messing with when we make everything that we do have to be something that's thought out deliberately and subjected to a kind of thought control experiment. Will this pass muster, or will I suddenly become an untouchable? Because that's what happens. So it's a very cruel world, first of all. It's not at all an intelligent world or an imaginative world. So the people who seem to shout the loudest seem to see only one thing, and never that the other person might have a point of view, that this needs to be talked about in shades of meaning. Not the imagination to see beyond their own point. So it's very harmful. And it also takes up an awful lot of people's time and attention, which is not consolidated attention as you might pay to a great work of art for perhaps an hour, but a kind of fragmented attention, which is exactly what the left hemisphere's world is made of. I look at this, I look at that target, I look at the next target. It's looking for targets all the time, whereas the right hemisphere literally has a quite different kind of attention. And no neurologist in the world will dispute this. It sees the periphery of attention, the whole broad field, and it sees it in depth, where the left hemisphere tends to see a two-dimensional screen on which things are projected. So this sense of the depth and the broad has been lost. And I think that's also important because we don't understand, first of all, the degree to which we importantly belong to a society and owe something to the society that helped to create us. And even if we think we are rebels, and even if we think that we reject everything from our society, that's absolutely fine. But that point of view is itself something that has come out of one's culture. The possibility to do that and the will to do that. But if we don't understand enmeshment with other living beings, including non-human beings, I would say, very, very importantly. So in space, as it were, we don't see ourselves as ramifying into a whole, which is larger than ourselves and knows more than we do. But also we don't see it in time. We've time sliced. Time has become very thin. It's this moment now where I am. But this moment came from many others and will lead to many others in the future. In that sense, it's more like a melody than anything else. You don't make a melody by putting together a note and another note, but it's a flow. And Burke made this very important point that a society was not just an association of people, but it was the association of those people now with those who lived in the past and those who would come to live in the future. Which is why in many stable societies, other than our own present one, people pay attention to what the elders thought, to what the traditions that they inherited have to say about this. This means that instead of being like a rudderless ship that can be blown anyway by whatever wind happens to spring up, they have some point to refer to. This may sound conservative, but it doesn't have to be at all. I believe that the way we make progress is not by cutting off the strain of life, the stem from which we grow, and then finding ourselves with nothing to feed us and no idea of where we should be. But it is from that growing, flexible, trainable organism that the next steps come. So a tradition, if you want to call it that, is always growing and changing, but doing so in a way that has meaning at the time rather than abstract fiats from somebody who is intolerant and says, this is what we must do. I think the first thing to say when people say this is what we must do is, well, maybe or maybe not. In fact, no, people don't say that enough.
What you're sketching out feels like a parallel with what John Bavacki talks about, which is a sense of domicide, which he describes as a sense of losing one's home, effectively, losing one's home in a sort of more
How much longer you want
cosmic sense, that we're sort of strangers in our own land now.
Precisely, and that is what I talked about in The Master and His Emissary as having forfeited the sense of belonging, and pointed out that the root of the word belonging is the same as the root for longing, which is the sense of being connected to something but stretched away from it. And we have no sense of that tethering to a place, to a time, to a collection of those that we love, to our own place in this cosmos. Instead, we see ourselves as completely like vagrants in the universe with no place which has meaning for us, and no place of connection with what came before or after. And that is the consequence of this fragmenting, driven attention of the left hemisphere, looking for the next step forward, which will make it more powerful.
You can see the whole interview by going to peerand.live.